Michelle, you must be very happy with a standing room only. Quite a draw you must be, man of steel there. It's a privilege and a pleasure to introduce Dean Claude Steele of the Graduate School of Education for this afternoon's presentation in the award-winning Teachers series. Teaching is both demanding and delightful, and the award recognizes those who are able to combine these two facets. Dean Steele, who joined the GSOE faculty as Dean and Professor in 2011, is still referred to on occasion as the new Dean. My experience suggests that new doesn't really last that long, Claude. Yeah. While he comes to Stanford from his prior appointment as Provost and Professor of Psychology at Columbia University, his ties to Stanford are very long-standing. He joined the psychology faculty in 1991, serving as chair from 1997 to 2000, and in 2005 he was appointed director of it's the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, the closest thing to heaven for some of us. Claude has received numerous awards during his career, including election to the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Education, and a distinguished science contribution from the American Psychological Association. But the occasion for this afternoon's address is his receipt of the Dean's Teaching Award from Stanford in 1995. It took a while, but I'm sure it will be worth the wait. In preparing this introduction, two parallels with Claude's career and my own came to mind, and I'll mention them as a personal note. One is that both of us began as psychologists. Claude's doctorate was in social psychology from the Ohio State University. The Graduate School of Education here at Stanford, since the tenure of Dean James in the 1960s, has been notable for its mix of professional and disciplinary appointments, and so people like us really do fit in. The move from this early focus on science toward practical application, though, has been a hallmark of Claude's career, as you will learn very shortly, but a fairly long time. The other connection is less well known, and I'm not quite sure how it will bear on today's presentation, but I'm going to mention it anyway. It was a surprise when I went through your vita and happened on this. Claude has an extensive publication record. Most recently, Whistling Vivaldi, How Stereotypes Affect Us and What We Can Do. It's really a very compelling book. If you read the first few pages, you won't be able to put it down. But it takes a while to get to Vivaldi. But that's not the connection. While going through these early works, I encountered a 1973 publication that surprised me, but it also resonated. Both of us, early in our careers, conducted psychological studies using comparative methods. Now, for those of you who don't know what that means, we ran rats. Right. It was the 70s, things like that happened. There was funding for it. Even more intriguing, though, was your choice of the Long Evans hooded rat for the studies. I also used Long Evans hooded rats because I thought they looked more interesting than plain albinos, but as Claude may know, they are also smarter. Did you know that? Yeah, it's true. It's on Google. So, and here is, I'm not going to bother to put it up, but if you want to see it later, or you can just go Google Long Evans, and here's a literate Long Evans albino rat. They do exist. So I don't know how stereotype threat might apply to the self-perceptions of other species, but we're now going to learn about the significant roles that this particular pattern can play with regard to humans, especially students. And so it's my pleasure to present to you Dean Claude Steele.
Thanks, that was great. Thank you. Well, thanks, that was a wonderful introduction. I haven't had anybody refer to my rat research in probably 35 years. It was a lot of fun. It was kind of crazy. We had a grant to study school integration, and it was perfectly reasonable in that scientific paradigm to think that you could get a good sense of it by mixing albino rats with hooded rats. And so that's how much time would they spend in contact? And anyway, I won't defend it, but that's what we that's what we were up to. Well, I would just like to give an overview of our research on stereotype threat and social identity threat in general. The strategy I'm going to try to take is to rather than defend the scientific case, to kind of give you a closer feel of it, to focus on things that give you a sense of the phenomenon. I always fear when I talk at home that a lot of people have heard this stuff already, so bear with the repetition. I'm going to try to get as quickly as I can to things that you may be more interested in, remedies and skills that you can use to cope with these threats and that institutions can use to deal with these threats. So I'll try to speed along a little faster than I might ordinarily do. And also, I invite anybody anytime to ask me questions. That will get me focused on what you really want to hear about. So don't be shy. I could be right in the middle of something, raise your hand, and I'll be nice about it and interested, and we'll take off in that direction. Well, what I'll do first is describe the practical phenomenon that started this work, and then the phenomenon of stereotype threat, and then we'll get into remedies and how to cope with it. The phenomenon is practical. It's interesting that as a basic psychologist, I was at the University of Washington doing work on the nature of the self and self-regulation and on alcohol addiction. That was my extension into applied work at the time, a social psychological model of alcohol addiction, which I'd love to talk about sometime. But I moved to Michigan, and I got appointed to a committee, and I saw a pattern of data that were fascinating to me. It had the grade point averages of Michigan students, graduates, so all their cumulative GPAs at Michigan, graphed out as a function of the test scores, the ACTs or the SATs they had when they came into Michigan. And what you generally see is that the higher the test score they had when they came in, the slight tendency for there to be higher grades at the end of their time at Michigan. That's what those tests are supposed to do, is predict that. But they also had a line broken out for African American students, and that was what was fascinating and deeply puzzling to me. At every level of SAT, African American students were getting lower grade point averages than other students at Michigan. And that was a shock. My understanding of academic performance to that point was that if you were prepared, and equally prepared, let's say you got two kids with 1550 SAT scores, shouldn't they get the same grades? They've got roughly the same preparation as measured by the standardized tests that we rely on. They should, by all rights, be getting the same grade point average. So that fact that they weren't, and that they consistently weren't at every level of SAT, was the phenomenon that was puzzling. Why should that be? Something else must be going on in the environment that would cause that. We've quickly found the same thing happen for women in math, especially in the advanced math classes. Not so much in the introductory level math classes, but the same thing was happening in advanced level math classes. At Michigan, men and women, same SAT scores, women getting lower grades in those courses than men. So we thought we had a phenomenon, and we quickly found that this wasn't just something that happened in Michigan, it happened everywhere. You could just go in to almost any classroom, anywhere, almost at any level of schooling, and you could find the same thing, and it was well understood in the psychometric literature, labeled as underperformance, sometimes over-prediction. They had a variety of jargonistic words for this, but nobody quite knew what to make of it. Why was it there? What could it mean? I would say now I can make this statement in a more general area. In areas of performance where one, based on some identity we have, could be being older, and the area of performance is memory, for example. In some area of performance where, because of some identity you have, you're negatively stereotyped. You're under some suspicion of not being good in that area, based on what group you're a member of. Whenever that happens, there tends to be this underperformance phenomenon. It can be in sports, it can be in chess, it could be, as I say, in memory. So it is a very general phenomenon. How much it explains everything, we'll come to that. I don't want to overstretch. But there are certainly circumstances where it has a profound effect. Stereotype threat is a concept that's trying to explain that. I'll spare you all the floundering in the dark it took to get to that concept of it. One of the things I always like to convey in a talk about science is how none of these ideas were ideas we had when we started this. And I try to write the book in a way so you can sort of see what we were thinking at a certain time, look over our shoulder and see this is what we thought, and we put it to test and it was wrong. And that just keeps happening over and over again, and you have to kind of follow what data, reality is telling you. And that's where this concept that we eventually called stereotype threat. We called it 85 other things before we came to a term like this. It's a simple concept. Anytime you're in a situation for which a negative stereotype about one of your identities is relevant, you know you could be judged or treated in terms of that stereotype. And if you care about what you're doing, the prospect of being reduced to a stereotype in that situation is upsetting and distracting, and it can be a quite formidable force in life because it could be something you realize you're going to have to deal with in that domain on an ongoing basis. It's not going to be something that you just disprove on one occasion and it's never there again. It's going to be there on an ongoing basis because it's tied to this stereotype about your group in a particular society. And when you're in a situation where that's relevant, like taking a standardized test or performing in class or maybe speaking to your advisor or doing any of those kinds of things, the prospect, you have some sense that you could be seen in terms of the stereotype. How you behave could be seen that way, and it could result in your being treated or judged in terms of that stereotype. And as I say, if that's important, the situation is important to you, this could be really upsetting. And that's really what stereotype threat is. It happens to absolutely everybody. I think it happens a couple times a week, maybe a couple times a day, that we walk into a situation where based on some kind of an identity we know we could be seen in a way we don't want to be seen, and that can be upsetting. So it's a very common kind of phenomenon. I'm arguing that it may come to affect certain groups in very important academic performance situations, but it will affect all of us in all kinds of situations. The title of the book is based on a story that comes from Brent Staples, who is an op-ed writer, African-American editorialist for the New York Times, and he has a autobiography describing being a graduate student in psychology, interestingly, at the University of Chicago. And as he walks down the streets of Hyde Park, he realizes that, he's a big guy, dressed like a student, African-American guy. He's making people nervous. And they avoid eye contact, and some people cross the street, and it bugs him that he's having this effect. That he realizes from their behavior that he's being seen through the lens of a stereotype, that he is a possibly menacing young African-American male on the south side of Chicago, and they're scared. So he worries and worries, and he talks about this at great length in the book, but eventually, incidentally, he is trying to learn how to whistle, and he goes down the street whistling Beatles tunes and Vivaldi. And then everybody immediately stops seeing him that way. They say, "Hey, how are you, man? That's great," and the whole experience changes. And I think it's a perfect example of stereotype threat because it shows that you, at some level, how you're being seen or you could be seen. It's got you alert and vigilant. You're allocating cognitive resources to attending to this and what it means to you. And you may stumble on some way to present yourself that it's going to be less likely in a non-stereotypic way. So it sort of captures the whole cycle of stereotype and reaction to it. I gave a talk in education last year with my former students, distinguished professors they are now, Jeff Cohen and Greg Walton, and they encouraged me to spiffy up my materials. So I'm going to show you a couple of clips that you can trust I wouldn't have come up with myself. But they they did, and I think they help. One was to, well, let's get a situation where a group whose abilities, cognitive abilities, are not normally negatively stereotyped. Let's find a situation where they are and show that that stereotype threat can be a phenomenon, a problem for anybody. So what would that be? What would a white guy, what kind of situation would a white guy be in where his cognitive, intellectual abilities would be negatively stereotyped? Rapping. So just to give you again a sense of how powerful the experience can be, I'm going to show you the first few minutes of 8 Mile, which is the movie based on, it's the biography of Eminem, the great white rapper, who is, one hell of a rapper. And this is an intense, intellectual performance, because you have to, as you'll see, rapping is really hard. You have to come out on stage, 2 rappers. There's a coin flip. One rapper goes first. The other rapper goes second. The first rapper, his job is to insult and make all kinds of allegations about this poor second rapper. And he has to do it spontaneously, in time, and in rhyme. And there's a huge crowd beating, wanting to evaluate and hear how good a rapper he is. So you have to do it with all this bravado and so on, and you have to really pull this thing off. Then the second rapper has to essentially, on the spot, defend himself, to make up some kind of response to these allegations, and again, do it in time and in rhyme. And there's a crowd pulsing. So here we go. You'll get a sense of this is him backstage getting ready to go on stage as the movie opens.
Hold on! This ain't no such thing as halfway crooks. Scared to death and scared to live. Living the life that is diamonds and guns. There's numerous ways you can choose to earn funds. Some get shot, locked down, and turn nuns. Cowardly hearts and straight up shook ones, shook ones.
You think you going?
Going backstage, I'm in the battle.
You can't go backstage.
Man, come on, dog. I got a stamp on my hand,
You gotta go around front.
Man, you just seen me,
I didn't
dog.
see
I just
nothing.
came from
Out front, just like
Man, you
everybody.
just seen me. I just went to the bathroom.
Just like everybody.
Step.
I think you better.
Straight, dog. He's straight.
He with you?
Yeah.
Okay, cool, Future. But I think
I can spin that. I'ma murder this man.
First round.
He the type to lose a fight with. They don't laugh cause you whack, they laugh cause you white with a mic. You're a laughing stock, you know when it's laughing stop? When you would ever last, ass get popped. You a wigger that invented rhyme for.
Rabbit. DJ, kick it.
Not a good day for Eminem. The rest of the movie, as many of you I'm sure know, is sort of the story of how he overcomes this sense of threat and inability to perform. He's a great, and it turns out he's of course a great rapper, amazing lyrics and so on. But it's quite a journey before he kind of gets able and comfortable to perform. And he's constantly all the way up haunted by, and the opposing rappers constantly use this white with a mic stereotype that you can't do this. And so and the crowd has picked this up and so on. So it has a lot of things that I want to point to later, like the things that instantiate a sense of this identity threat, the cues in the situation, being the only white guy in the situation, people treating him as if he doesn't belong there at all, like, and then raising the stereotype, like, how could you possibly deign to do this? And so there are a lot of elements of it which I think give you a sense of how this threat is constructed in a situational way. In a different situation, different elements, different stereotypes might not happen at all. It's really very much a situational threat. So does it go to school? Does it affect cognitive functioning and the kind of performance we think of as school-based? Yeah.
Well, you know, with that situation there, in his face, so I mean, you really, really feel it. What I worry or wonder about is the when you're unsure, you know, the identity, do I fit, or the constant state of being, do I belong? There, no.
It's clear.
It's clear.
Yeah.
But it seems to me like the cumulative effect of not knowing. That seems to be another dimension here somewhere.
Yeah, it's a very good point about it. I mean, I've used the analogy sometimes. It's like a snake loose in the house. Could be a harmless snake. Maybe he's asleep. But it's hard to flop down on the couch and watch television with this possible threat there. And I think stereotype threat is a lot like that. You have no idea often whether or not you're being seen that way. You really can't confirm it. It isn't something that you can be really sure about. He can be sure about it, as you point out. But the threat, as you'll see, can be quite profound in situations where cues are a lot more subtle than the cues in that situation. And sometimes I think for that reason can be more absorbing and more haunting. Anyway, this is a clip that illustrates the possibility of this kind of threat affecting cognitive performance. It's from, again, something you may have seen, the Blueeyed, Browneyed experiment. You may have heard about this, where the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, a teacher, Jane Elliott, in Riceville, Iowa, is trying to come up with a demonstration that will illustrate to her kids what King's life was about and what it was devoted to, what the issue was. So she decides that she's going to divide the class into blue-eyed and brown-eyed kids, and on alternate days stigmatize one or the other of the groups. And she stays up and sews little blue collars or little brown collars, and then she goes to school the next day, and she has the brown-eyed kids put on the brown collars, and she begins to stigmatize them in front of the class by saying all kinds of horrible things, much like the other rapper here said. Brown-eyed kids are not as smart as blue-eyed kids. They don't smell as good. They're not nice. You can't trust them. They should sit in the back of the class. And so she gets them up and marches them to the back of the class. And the camera follows them, if you've ever seen some of the original footage of the first reenactment of this thing. And it's quite thank goodness, nobody could do this experiment today. It's just horrific, the effect that has on kids. And the next day she turns the tables. That's the only good news here, is that the next day the brown-eyed kids are favored and the blue-eyed kids are told exactly the same things the brown-eyed kids were told the day before. And you can go online and find all kinds of follow-ups to this. The kids are now, elderly, and they're interviewed about this and so on. But one of the things in the original documentary that didn't get much attention is she takes the kids at a certain point in the day to the side of the room, and they work through a problem deck of problems. And the question is, how fast do they get through the deck? And you kind of see the effect of having a collar on the rate with which they get through the deck.
I use Orton Gillingham Phonics. We use the card pack. And the children, the brown-eyed children, were in the low class the first day, and it took them 5.5 minutes to get through the card pack. The second day, it took them 2.5 minutes. The only thing that had changed was the fact that now they were superior people.
You went faster than I've ever had anyone
everyone go through the card pack. Why couldn't you get them yesterday?
We had those collars on.
You think the collars kept you?
Just keep thinking about those collars.
Oh.
And my eyes kept getting rolling around.
Oh, and you couldn't think as well with the collars on.
Well,
4 minutes and 18 seconds.
I know we weren't going to make it.
How long did it take you yesterday?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. How long did it take you today?
4 minutes and 18 seconds.
What happened?
One down.
Why? What were you thinking of?
This.
Yeah, so the research question is these are very strong cues, obviously, that instantiate an identity threat. Collars and allegations hurled in the air. Do subtler cues, could they make a difference, and could they affect behaviors that we think of as kind of impervious to these kinds of emotions? Yeah.
Was there also, so the blue-eyed kids, they really had blue eyes.
Yeah.
And so was there any effect in whether the speedy days or the slow days of them still between the blue-eyed and the brown-eyed? Because it was after the death of Martin Luther King. Then I would still think that the brown-eyed kids, maybe they were really more brown. And the white eyes, maybe they had white hair. So maybe there would also be the effect of the stereotype which actually exists, as opposed to just the stereotype she created by the colors.
I can't really, I don't know I can't get to the level of data that I'd need to answer that question. It's a possibility, I don't know, but what I know is what you just saw with regard to that demonstration. But I think all these things sort of come out in the wash of research. The studies that we do, and I'll describe those, and I think I hope they'll answer your question. That is the sort of the next question. Can you, in a realistic academic, a true to life, I suppose, academic situation, do these effects happen there too? Remember, we had this underperformance phenomenon out here that I described earlier. Could you get that in a laboratory situation with relatively ordinary academic cues around? So the very first study that we did, Steve Spencer and I, who's visiting here this year, was with women in math. And we got women and men, sophomores and juniors at the University of Michigan, who were really good in math by all preliminary measures, grades and test scores and their commitment to math and the like. They were really, really good at it. And we brought them into the laboratory one at a time, and we gave them a very difficult math test, a half-hour section of the graduate record exam you would take if you were a math major, not the general quantitative section, but the math major section. And we knew that would cause frustration for these very good math students, and we also knew these were people who were very committed to math. It wasn't a casual thing for them. They were invested in it. So for our following our reasoning, or our evolving reasoning at the time, this should be a very different situation for women than it should be for men, even though everything objectively in the situation is the same for women and men. The same items, the same experimenter, the same tables in the room, everything is identical. But for men, when they encounter the frustration on this test, there is some worry that maybe they're not as good at math as they thought they were, and since they're so invested in it, that could be upsetting. But in addition to that, women would have this worry that maybe, what the people say about women's math ability is, well, maybe I'm confirming that. Or maybe I'm going to be seen to confirm that. So on top of their own personal worries, they've got this other worry that they are really hitting a sort of gender-based limitation of ability that is very upsetting. That prospect is much more upsetting to people, I can say, after years of this research, than thinking you yourself lack the ability. To think that you lack the ability because of your membership in a category is much more upsetting than to think that you lack the ability personally. So we thought this would be a very different situation, and it turned out to be that way. Women, even though they were carefully matched in skills, performed a standard deviation worse than men in this situation. But this could be evidence in behalf of the stereotype, the truth of the stereotype, that there is a biological difference between men and women that manifests itself on really difficult math. After all, that's the kind of stereotype that Larry Summers, I hope regretfully, used several years ago when he said that maybe there aren't the lack of women in math and science, maybe that's due to lack of ability at the high end. So we'd given a test at the high end and we found a gender difference, so maybe he was right. Who was right, us or him? Was it biology or was it stereotype threat? And we had to come up with an experiment that would separate these two things. If we were right and you could take the stereotype threat out of that situation, then women's math performance on that same test should go up to match that of equally skilled men. So after a long time, a year, we came up with a very simple way of doing that. We told men and women just before they sat down to take the test that you may have heard that women don't do as well as men on difficult standardized math tests. You may have heard that. But that's not true for this test. The test you're taking today is a test on which women always do as well as men. And the subtext of that is anything that you experience here is not because you're a woman. It's because maybe it's something about you, but not because of anything about your being a woman. So with a single sentence that reframes the meaning of this situation, what it does is to make that stereotype floating in our society about women's math ability, it makes that stereotype irrelevant to interpreting your personal experience in this test-taking situation. Without us doing that, that stereotype is relevant. So when we did that, women's math performance went up to match that of equally skilled men. There's no difference. Well, we were quite heartened, relieved. I said maybe relief was the biggest, because you can see the risk of this experiment was that we would have confirmed the other hypothesis. So there was tension, needless to say. But by that point, we had to find out what it was. Well, race. Josh Aronson and I looked at the same thing in the context of race. I'll just give you somebody else did an even nicer study. I'll tell you that one. This is done by Browneyed. And they just gave white and black college students an IQ test, a Raven's Progressive Matrices IQ test, which is the gold standard of IQ tests. It's a nonverbal test. It's like working on a puzzle, which, as you'll see, is very important to this experiment. There's a big square or matrix, and there's a pattern on it, and you got 5 little squares with patterns on those, and you got to pick the little square with the same pattern as the big square. And the problems start out really easy, and then they get really, really frustrating and hard, and that is, again, our view of when the stereotype about your group becomes relevant to interpreting your personal experience. You're having frustration on something that's supposed to measure an ability that your group is stereotyped as not having. That's upsetting because you care about this domain. It's distracting and your performance goes down, and that's exactly what happened in this situation. Black students performed a standard deviation, which on an IQ test is about 15 points worse than white students on this IQ test when it was presented to them as an IQ test, or they were allowed to assume it was an IQ test. When that happened, big drop for black students on this test. This time, the experiment that takes out the stereotype threat from the situation, the instruction that takes it out, is very simple. They just said to the participants, this is not a test of cognitive abilities. This can't measure your cognitive abilities. This is just a test. This is a puzzle. We just want you to relax and have fun with this puzzle. Okay? Well, when you do a puzzle, frustration, you like that. That's a good thing. That excites you, and it gets you engaged. And as soon as you do that, no difference between black and white students on this test. Now you play this out in society for all kinds of, where can you, almost any situation where intellectual competence, ability is on the line, for these groups, these stereotypes are relevant and can be used to interpret their experience. One of the most amazing images I have early in this work we did in a junior high school in Palo Alto. We gave a really hard math test to boys and girls, And the difference in the reaction between the boys and the girls, I'll never forget it. The boys were like, they found out they didn't do well, and the boys say, well, that's just a stupid test. You know, to tell you that my teacher is not that good this year, and we really never even covered that stuff that well. And they kind of whistle out of the room. It doesn't seem to bother them so much. But for girls, when they get this bad feedback back, they say, maybe I'm not so good at math. And here's the stereotype framework of this society coming down to affect the interpretation of personal experience. We very quickly did these experiments on women in math in Poland. And in Poland, because there is such equal representation of women and men in the quantitatively based fields, math, physics, engineering, physicians, that stereotype there is very weak. And there you don't get the same underperformance for women in quantitative fields. There are societies where that stereotype is really weak, and you don't get the same kind of difference you get in the United States. Yeah.
So you've been describing situations where the experimenter or the society, as in Poland, can sort of say to people, what in other situations might be stereotype threats don't exist in this one. In various ways, you can reframe the situation so people don't feel vulnerable. I'm curious, can an individual do that for themselves? For example, if a math female student is a feminist and says to herself, I'm not going to buy into the stereotype that we women have problems in math, do you know if sort of coaching yourself personally that way can overcome the situation the way the reframing in other ways seems to be able to do it?
That's a great question. I suppose the quickest answer would be no and then yes. A lot of the effect is coming from women being in that situation and fighting the truth of the stereotype. And because you're fighting the truth of the stereotype and you're suppressing it, you're allocating cognitive resources to that effort and not to the task at hand. So you've got kind of a multitasking going on. And that's where the underperformance in these situations is happening. It's not happening from people giving up and being overwhelmed or buying into the stereotype directly. They're fighting the stereotype because, remember, there are people who are really invested in doing well in the domain. So it's important for them to do well in the domain. And they fight, and they fight, and they fight, and they fight. But if you're fighting, you're allocating a lot of energy to doing it. I had a woman scientist on the National Science Board this summer say to me, well, I've heard about that your stuff on Stereotype Threat. I think it's interesting, but I don't think I've ever been really that affected by it by stereotypes, because whenever that happened, whenever I sensed that could happen, I just really redoubled my efforts and I kind of disproved that stereotype. That's what I've done that all my life. So here's a whole life dedicated to a strategy of resisting something. And God knows what price was paid in that situation, across that life, what choices were shaped and so on. So it's like that. It's more that kind of phenomenon. But yes, the other is there are strategies that I think greatly reduce the impact personally. I'll maybe elaborate them a little bit more later on, but certainly one I think is Carol Dweck's stuff on thinking of math and cognitive life in general, as intelligence in general, as a malleable thing. Then frustration doesn't have the same devastating effect it has as if you think that it reflects a fixed ability. If you think it reflects a fixed ability, then that plus the stereotype, and you experience a little frustration in your first math classes at a university like this one, you're out of there, because it's a powerful signal that, well, maybe I just this is I don't know. It just doesn't feel good and doesn't feel like you should hang in there like that. So there are things that I'll enumerate some more later on, but there are definitely individual strategies that I think reduce it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the role of the family in encouraging the children and how they perceive themselves, and if there's been any connection with that? I mean, they're getting a lot of stereotype threats in the system, but have you made any connection with the family and their contribution to the child's self-perception of themselves?
Yeah, you know, it may be what you're thinking and it may not be. I'll tell you what I know, or what I think I know. It isn't something that you can repress by giving kids a lot of sort of confidence building strategies and a sense of a positive self-esteem. That's what nurses you into the situation that makes you vulnerable to the threat. What's making you vulnerable to the threat is that you are crazy enough to really try hard and care about a domain of life where your group is negatively stereotyped. You've invested in this domain where all the time that you're in the domain, you're going to have to be dealing with the possibility of being negatively stereotyped. It takes a very strong person to do that. And I think families who support strong development and support strong kids can wind up putting their kids in exactly that kind of situation. That's a good situation. I'm going to argue that's a very good thing. But it doesn't make you invulnerable or protect you from the threat. It can actually make the threat worse. One of the things that hit us over the head in this research is that it is not the members of the group who feel the least confidence or have the worst skills or have the lowest self-expectations who are affected by the threat. They're not affected by the threat. They're not affected by the threat. The women that don't care about math, they don't care whether they're taking a test that's where they could confirm the stereotype or not confirm the stereotype. They've got a certain protection against the whole stereotype threat thing because they don't care about the domain. One thing you can do to protect yourself from stereotype threat is to just give up caring about the whole domain where your group is negatively stereotyped. If you start to care about it, that's when you get that's when the prospect of being stereotyped like this is really upsetting because you've got a personal investment here and you're going to have to be dealing with this on an ongoing basis. Then it really becomes a condition of life. I've got another clip I won't take time to show here. It's of Charles Blow, who's another African-American editorialist for the New York Times, the guy on Saturday who does those graphic op-ed pieces. And he's talking about his experience after the Trayvon Martin situation and how what a kind of constant ongoing burden it is. You get on elevators and you feel like you have to behave in a certain way as to avoid being seen suspiciously, or walking down the streets, or certainly seeing police. You have to really regulate your body in a way on an ongoing basis not to incur a certain perception of yourself. You're whistling Vivaldi like mad in certain situations to avoid. So it becomes a condition of life like that. That's an important feature of the threat. So now, sometimes in a less handsome way, I've seen families enable kids to I think, this is my interpretation. I don't have good experimental data on this at all. I just have really, I'm here, I'm no better than any other observer of people. But some families, like for example, women who tend to do well, American women who tend to do well in math and the natural sciences, often have had fathers or brothers who have really told them that they could be good at it and have really kind of encouraged a certain perception of themselves as individuals, without trying to say what about women or address the whole group, just as I think you can do this. Then a person sort of can acquire a sense of part of that has to be, I think you'll be seen that way. Then a person gets a certain sense of, well, I don't know how they're going to see all the women, but I think they'll see it in me. I've certainly seen this in the African American community. I don't know how they're going to see all of African Americans, but I think you're going to always be seen as I've seen families do that, as a person with promise, and that will, if you can socialize that strategy, help. It's not completely handsome as a strategy, but because you're saying there's something about me that's different to my group, and so it's, yeah, you had your.
When you brought that up, you said fathers and brothers. I think significance there being that it's other sexes telling this to
Could be.
young women.
Mm-hmm.
If you were going to import that into the realm of race, does that mean that this sense of protection or I guess individual protection from stereotype threat has to come from a different race? Or are you saying that it's something that's within the family? Because if you're going to say that others are needed to validate, that's a pretty significant sort of assertion.
Yeah, so I won't make it that significant because I don't quite believe that. I think anybody can, if kids can be influenced by anybody. So I think their families can help them adopt the ideas I was just talking about. But I also do think people from other groups can do that. They can be very powerful sometimes because they are speaking from another group about how you're going to be seen. And they can relax you, in a sense. I think sometimes our relationship with out-group members has that kind of an effect. It relaxes you. Oh, in this relationship, I'm just not being seen that way. I think I had that kind of relationship with my advisor in graduate school. I talk about it in the book where there were clearly, there were professors in the program that would use the N-word just openly in those days. So I knew without a doubt what was going on around there. But my own advisor, who wasn't a particularly sophisticated race guy, he believed in me, and so that I could tell that, and in that relationship, I had a great sense of freedom from this. I was so grateful for it. It worked well. I appreciate a bow, man.
So, what I'm hearing you say is that there needs to be a sense of authority from the person that is kind of giving you this protection against stereotype threat. In the case of Eminem, it would be his black friend that vouches for him. In the case of the test, it would be the people that are saying this is not a test that women do poorly on. That's an authority saying that. And in the case of family, it would be sort of parents in one case, and in another case, male family members.
Yeah. Yes. That's a good bow.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that the male, they have more authority.
Yeah,
like the positive encouragement may be even stronger from a mother or sister who is a scientist. Mm-hmm. But maybe you said brother or father just because whatever we wish. There are not so many women scientists who could do the encouragement.
Well, this could get us down a long tunnel. I think authority can be a factor, and the out-group sometimes can speak with some authority. I wouldn't deny that that's not a reality. I don't think that's absolutely necessary. That is, I think anybody in the in-group can also encourage this kind of perspective. I don't think, for example, my advisor had nearly the same effect on me that my father had, who gave me a great deal of instruction as an African-American male of his generation, a great deal of instruction about how to deal with the complications of race in all kinds of circumstances. That was ongoing to the point of, okay, I got it, dinner table kind of conversation about what to do and how to expect, and it was good training for a psychologist, I think. Yeah.
I think there's a distinction that people have made between gaining general self-confidence and strategies as you've described your father giving you, and the sense of self-efficacy that comes from someone who is a recognized domain expert who makes that assessment. So the fact that you heard from your advisor that he had no doubt that you could be a fantastic psychologist, and he was in psychology, made much more of a difference than somebody else in some other authority role or family role or anything else. I think sometimes it's very domain specific when you're making that, because you talked about the fathers who encouraged their daughters, but they themselves were mathematicians or in mathematics related fields. Yeah. Had they not been, arguably their encouragement might not have been interpreted in the same way.
Yeah, I think that's a very good, agree with that. Yeah.
I know you kind of said that what got you onto this path of discovering Stereotype Threat was that initial incident at Michigan and just looking at kind of those grades. And as you might know, or you might even think, some of those legacies still endure of just underperformance now. So I guess, like, with the robustness of Stereotype Threat, what do you think has been the barrier for people from adapting kind of this idea and these practices into their own teaching or into strategies to really help students overcome those particular challenges?
Yeah, I can't claim to completely understand that, the answer to that question. I think I have some hunches. It takes a long time for ideas to be absorbed and then used. It just does. And I think these are different enough ideas, and they're of a type that people don't like. We're not quite comfortable thinking this much variance can be explained by a psychological thing. We really want to. One of the big impressions I have coming into the field of education in a much more big way in recent years is how much education thinks of itself as primarily a cognitive activity, not a sort of socio-emotional developmental activity. And thinking of it as a cognitive activity, having that as a paradigm for what really explains who learns, how fast we learn, how we should structure things, what good curriculum is, what good teaching is, everything being reduced to a sort of cognitive account, misses these things and doesn't give people the language for incorporating these kinds of things, even though they can be sitting there as big as an elephant for centuries. We're blinded by our paradigm. So I do see a lot of that, which I think is a factor. It's just hard to believe that. Do you really think that, changing these instructions? I mean, the years of going through this research is probably 25 years old. We've been sort of developing these ideas. You get the effect, and you have to make them replicable yourself. Then you have to pray to God that somebody else can replicate them. And then after people go out and try to replicate them, and some people fail, and then there's a meta-analyzer comes along and adds up all of the things and puts them together. And so there's a lot of phases to a scientific idea getting kind of to the point where the scientific community is going to sort of say that we can count on that. I think we're at that point with regard to this concept at this point. I waited a long time to write a book about it because I just really wanted to have a strong sense of what a whole community would say, a whole community of scientists would say about the idea. But now I really think there needs to be a huge amount of work translating it and developing practices and skills and pulling them out of the muck and polishing them off and saying, if you do this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you can greatly reduce these effects. Then I think it starts to move a little bit. Yeah.
Could you just talk a little bit about the mechanism, the psychological mechanisms, like is it cognitive impairment or anxiety?
Yeah. The question is, what's the mechanism behind these effects? There is a good amount of research on that now. The general pattern is that when a person is experiencing stereotype threat, every physiological bell is ringing. Heart rate, blood pressure, the prefrontal cortex tends to be suppressed. The amygdala, which is more sensitive to threat and vigilant to threat, that's very activated. So there's a lot going on there when a person's under this threat. Interestingly, if you ask them to self-report on that, people have very little ability to do that. They just say, we just knew this right from the beginning. We talked to people in those experiments. We would see them blow the test. We'd say, how do you feel? I feel fine. I feel fine. It's, this is a test. When tests happen, when I'm in tests, I just sort of buckle down and go at it. So we don't have a subjective grasp of it, but it seems to be mediated by, there's impairments of short-term memory, there's impairments of sort of deep processing where you take information and process it more in relation to deeper cognitive structures and so on. Everything like that is impaired. You're given information, you don't pick it up. You're given the instructions, you don't pick it up. Because it's like multitasking. You think you're picking it up, but you're not picking it up. You need to just relax and be in there in the moment, and it's very hard to do that when you're shoveling all these accounts of yourself around inside you.
idea that either the woman or the actor does anonymity help to reduce this threat? Like, is that why the SATs seem to not let no one is watching you take the test? And if so, if anonymity helps, then is this direction that's growing now in terms of online education, would that potentially help in terms of effective performance?
You know, anonymity might be a factor. I don't think there's been really enough work on that, and I think the online world is going to make that a lot more relevant. I think it's a very timely question, but for the most part, anonymity won't wipe it out if you really want to do well in that area. If you really want to do, you're identified with that area, and you know, are women all alone in a room? That's almost essentially they're in an anonymous situation and experiencing profound threat. Yeah.
We've discussed and you've mentioned some of these negative sort of effects or aspects of this kind of stereotyping.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, is there a positive sort of effect that you see as well? For example, Jamaican sprinters or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Don't get me started on sports and why they're so identity configured. There are obvious historical structural reasons for that. Why the swimmers are all white, why the sprinters are all Jamaican. But I also think these factors play a reinforcing effect on some of those differences. But regard to, if your group is positively stereotyped in a domain, or if you are sort of, you know, on the upside of another group's negative stereotype, that's a good thing. That helps you. There's the phenomenon called Stereotype Lift. And I think the way it happens is that when you're, I use the example of myself, African-American male, being a terrible basketball player, but it never occurring to me that I didn't belong out there because this was kind of what we do. So I could endure a lot of mediocrity and, you know, bad performance and screw-ups and not come to the conclusion very slowly at any rate that I'm not good at this and don't belong here. Because that's what we do, and everybody I grew up, that's what we did. And so now, what I think it is that the frustration that happens does not signal this global worry that you don't belong in the domain when you're positively stereotyped there. So for the boys taking the difficult math test I described, it was frustrating and bad and they flunked it, but it doesn't signal a global idea that they don't belong there or that they're not good at math. It doesn't signal that global idea. So free of that anxiety, you can take a lot of frustration and keep going. And maybe you'll have a success. And then, so it's a very different experience to be a member of a positively stereotyped group in the domain compared to a negatively stereotyped group. Yeah.
In the academic environment, like in science and engineering, where women and underrepresented minorities are extraordinarily underrepresented, could you comment on the effect of that underrepresentation on stereotype threat, and maybe what you think about interventions there might be to change the makeups of departments or improve performance of students in engineering and science departments?
Yeah, that's a good, I'll tell you the Sandra Day OConnor story. It's in the book. It's a chestnut. She's being interviewed by Nina Totenberg and about her autobiography. And at some point, Nina asked her, what was it like to be the first woman on the Supreme Court? And she says, it was asphyxiating. It was asphyxiating. Everywhere I went, the reporters followed me into restaurants, up the steps of my house. After every decision, there were these oceans of telephone messages. People in the press talked about my intelligence. Was I wise? Was I good? Was I a feminist? Was I too feminist? And it was hell being on the Supreme Court as the only woman. And Nina says, well, what was it like when Ruth Bader Ginsburg got there? And she says, everything changed. It was like night and day. After a while, it just didn't make sense for all this attention to two women. How smart are two women? It didn't. So the things that she had to deal with because of her identity, we call those contingencies of identity, those things just actually changed as a function of who else was there. And I heard this interview a month before the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action was announced in 2003. And I was an expert witness on the side of University of Michigan in that case, so I knew what their case was. And their case was that you needed to have this policy because you needed to have critical mass of groups. You just couldn't have groups, you know, single individuals in a university that big, that especially with the historical significance of these identities. It would be too much of a burden on those people. You had to have some numbers there that would relax the situation. So critical mass was the defense of and she was a swing vote. So I felt I knew how it was going to go, and it went that way. She knew what critical mass was. She knew what it was like to have it and what it was like not to have it. She actually had an experiential referent to critical mass that she could use, and probably the other justices didn't, or they didn't call it to mind at any rate. They may well have had that. But so indeed, the numbers around, I think that's why the Poland situation worked out the way it worked out, is because the stereotype might be there, but it doesn't have any evidential basis in a situation where there's critical mass and where there's a more greater distribution, and so people doesn't have the same power over you. So critical mass in these things is very important. In our own research, that variable sticks out. People count. We all count. If we're in a situation where we think based on some identity there aren't many of us, we're counting. And the question is, why are we counting? What are we're looking for? Is this identity going to be, I'm the only old guy here? Is this, yeah.
Is there a difference between stereotype threat and identity threat? And also, can you talk about how the stereotypes develop?
I'll answer the first question, your second question first. I believe stereotypes, certainly of the sort that we're talking about in this research, are history. It's how history visits us in the present and actually affects our lives. We did a study on white stereotype threat in interracial interactions. Powerful form of stereotype threat. We brought in white guys, one at a time. They were going to have a conversation with either two black guys or two white guys. And they find out they're going to have the conversation either about love and relationships, which is an easy topic, or it's going to be racial profiling. So they find out they're going to have a conversation with either two white guys or two black guys, and it's going to be either racial profiling or love and relationships. And then we say, well, we're going to go down the hall and get your conversational partners and bring them back. While we're gone, would you arrange the chairs for the conversation? And as soon as they arrange the chairs, you know, the experiment's basically over at that point. We're interested, as a function of the conversation that they anticipate, how they're going to distance themselves in relation. And you can predict the results. That when they're going to talk to two white guys about anything, the three chairs are very close together. When they're going to talk to two black guys about love and relationships, the three chairs are very close together. But when you're going to talk to two black guys about racial profiling, you kind of put the two black guys down there and yourself at a distance. A distance between us starts to emerge. And interestingly, we had measures of prejudice. Now, in the Stanford student population, we don't really have many people on the high prejudice end of that continuum. We measured both explicitly and implicitly. So we had pretty good measures. And the interesting thing is that in that condition, you're talking to two black guys about racial profiling. Who puts their chair the farthest away? The least prejudiced people or the most prejudiced people? The least prejudiced people. Which women show the stereotype threat effects the most? Those that are really invested in math, or those that are... You have to be invested in the domain to feel the threat. And it really bespeaks. Now this is how back to your question, I think this is how history visits us. The stereotype that whites are afraid of in that situation is that they're going to make some conversational mistake and be seen as racist or racially insensitive or unknowing of something really important. And for people that are invested in not being seen that way, that's very upsetting and distracting. And you kind of want to distance yourself from that situation. But it's almost the inverse of what we really think would be going on in that distancing. We think distancing reflects prejudice or dislike, and here it's not that. It's this threat. It's how these stereotypes are bringing our history as a nation to bear on these interactions. They're mechanisms of history, importing it into the present and affecting how we function down on the ground. So that's where these stereotypes come from. If we went to Lagos, Nigeria, as I've often used that example, being black would not have anything like the same meaning it has here. Everybody's black. It wouldn't mean anything. Other things like whether you're an Igbo, that would mean a lot. What your tribal identity is, what your religious identity is, urban, rural, those things, those societies organized that way. And that's how, and the stereotype structures go up that way. And that would be the identity. But being black would be, and if you were an American and you went there and you stayed there for 25 years, you'd forget all about what happened, what it means to be black here. And if you came back, you'd have to relearn it. You'd have to figure it out again. Well, what's it like now? So it really is tied to these histories and these particular circumstances. Poland has a different history about all this, about gender, and therefore a different effect. But what was your first question?
Is there a difference between identity threat and stereotype threat?
Yeah, I think identity threat can sometimes happen without a particular stereotype being involved. Stereotype threat is a more specific form of identity threat, driven by the fact that everybody here could take out a piece of paper and write down the stereotypes of the major groups in our society, in this region for sure. And so, and stereotype threat is an intersubjective perception. It's what I think you might be thinking based on who I think you are. Now, if you were just brand new in this society, I might not feel much stereotype threat around certain identities because I know you don't know anything. You don't know the stereotypes yet. So it's always an intersubjective thing of that sort.
At what age people start feeling this or perceiving this?
4.
4.
That's my belief. Maybe 3. I've got 2 grandsons who are 3 and 4, and I don't know how far I should go into that story, but one looks Caucasian, one clearly black, and how they negotiate this at that age are really different. So it's in our family, the one that looks more white, more Caucasian, senses that there's something positive about being black. So he said on several occasions, well, I used to be black when I was in Africa. So he just concocts this story. So he's dealing with whatever he thinks is the perception. But they both just report experiences in preschool which make me aware that the kids are aware of how their group is perceived. They don't know the content of the stereotypes or anything. But you get these doll study effects. Black kids preferring white dolls over black dolls. You still get them, of course, and you get them in 4-year-olds. So even though the stereotype is not they can't articulate that, I think they know how your group is seen pretty quick.
And is there an explanation? Like, how do they know that it's 4? I couldn't even read at 4.
Oh man, they know about the Avengers, and they know about Superman, and they're just absorbing everything. They're absorbing all kinds of cues. You don't have to read to know that, and you might get a sense that black people are seen a certain way. You might get a sense of that. We can talk about that, man.
Do you have children?
So, Dean Steele, you've generously given us a lot more of your time. I guess I'm getting a little worried about your schedule. So please feel free to make the next question your last, or.
Okay. Well, I can stay till 1:30, so we'll make that up. If you can stay till 1:30, okay. Sure. And people will have to leave. So.
Wonderful.
It was so nice of you to be responsive to questions, but you are going to tell us about the applications, like what teachers can do to reverse the effect. So maybe we don't have enough time, but is there an article about it, or can you still summarize? Or
Yes, chapter 9 in that very inexpensive book lays out the kind of the research on what to do about it. But quickly, well, the first thing, I add a concept here, which is that the way to think about stereotype threat and identity threat is as a contingency of identity. I start the book with a story about when I first learned I was black, African American. And it was coming home from school, probably in the 3rd grade, something like that, if my memory serves me. And in Chicago, which was a very segregated city at the time, and we're talking about what we're going to do over the summer, and somebody says, well, yeah, but we can't go to the swimming pool that's 3 blocks over except on Wednesday afternoons. And that opens up, what? Who is we? Who is they? Why would they do this? Who is, and if you, it sort of brings into view that you're a member of some group. And now you have to deal with that identity. You have to make sense with it. You have a lot of questions. You never get any answers about why all that's the case. But you have all these questions. And that segregation, those petty segregations of that era, which are many of them, make you aware of having an identity, of being in a particular group. And I'm calling those things contingencies of identity, things you have to deal with in a world, a society, because you have the identity. You can't avoid it. I don't want identity to be seen as just a psychological thing that you can choose to have or not have. You have to deal with that. And some contingencies of identity are concrete and on the ground, like those old segregations, and other contingencies of identity are more abstract and in the air, like stereotype threat. Like walking into a situation where the stereotype about your group is relevant and having to deal with the prospect of being seen this way and negotiating that and whistling Vivaldi. And those become contingencies. Those are contingencies of identity. So when you want to make identity, when you want to remedy this situation, the first thing you have to turn to, I think, in all honesty, is to get rid of unnecessary contingencies if you can. A math department might have only one woman's bathroom down on the basement floor. Well, there may be very innocent reasons why that happened over the years, but that is a contingency of identity. It seems irrelevant, but it makes somebody aware of something. It makes it something you have to deal with, and so we should get rid of those things. When I started doing work at Michigan, there were black fraternities and sororities, and there were, of course, white fraternities and sororities, and they rushed at different times. And so the freshmen, the blacks would stay in the dorm while all the whites went out and rushed. Well, that's an organization by race, which makes this whole race thing, we're not away from it yet. And there are a lot of these features of life. Gay marriage. That's a contingency of identity. Do we really need to have that for some? If we don't, we should get rid of it, because it's going to make that identity much more significant for anybody, for everybody. So that's the first level. The second level are cues in the situation which start to signal contingencies. And here I think things like role models, existence proofs, Barack Obama. He doesn't change the racial order in any way. Same racial order, history. He doesn't reverse all that massive inequality out there. But it's different society for African Americans when you could be the president, as opposed to being in a situation where you can't be the president. That's very different. So those role models, those symbols, they're important and significant. Very different for a woman where you can't be on the Harvard math faculty versus you could be. So that stuff is very important. I think how we represent diversity is very important. I'm a firm believer. I had a chance to think about this a lot when I was at Columbia. And I made the case that diversity is excellence. We tend to think of diversity as an enemy of excellence, that you are over here making a concession, letting in people to a school or a program, making concessions in some test scores or something to get them in, and that's undermining the excellence, and that's bad. It's a bad thing to do because you're undermining, your diversity is an enemy working against excellence. I just believe, have a totally different worldview about that. I don't believe you can have real excellence without diversity. And I take that statement as far as to say, if you don't have diversity, then you're limited in some way. Because most excellence, the biggest thing that fuels excellence is diversity of perspectives. Yes, of course, skills are important, and adding increments in skills and maintaining standards is very important. But that's not all important. And I've seen in my own field, the field just grew massively when women came into it. When I joined it, we were all a bunch of guys, and we were all doing math models of attitude change, and so on. We were just sort of competing over who could, come up with the most arcane math model for something, and we were doing the male thing with that. Women came in, the topics changed, the methodologies broadened, the field benefited, it grew infinitely much more important as a function of that. So I believe that's true in all sciences and in all endeavors. And so I see it as not something that's an enemy, and I also believe it's been the primary source of strength, problem-solving strength in American society, that we've had the unusual good fortune of being an immigrant, highly diverse society that could bring to bear a lot of perspectives on our problems. So that philosophy is much more welcoming of people when they come in, as opposed to a philosophy which says 3 points higher on your SATs means you're really a much better, smarter, wonderful person. That means you don't have a collar on. Then those little test score differences, no predictive value, of almost no predictive value. So we're way overestimating that and our ability to measure that. We've reified that and have ignored the contribution that diversity makes to the functioning of intellectual life and every other part of life. So that's a much more inclusive philosophy. I've already mentioned at the personal level the Dweckian stuff. I think that's very good, very important. I've always informally done that. Just think of ability as expandable. It is. It is. Takes hard work sometimes, but it really is expandable. The other one is, and I'll end with this, the kind of general narrative I can have about life, and somebody mentioned families earlier. I think this is where families can make a contribution. We can help ourselves and our kids and the people we mentor have a good, healthy narratives about the situations they're in. Here's a study that Greg Walton and Jeff Cohen did at Yale. They had white and black freshmen see a 40-minute videotape of a black kid who was a year and a half ahead of them at Yale. And the videotape starts out with him saying, look, when I first came to Yale, I hated it. It was horrible. I felt alienated. I just felt I'll never survive here. I went home every single weekend to the point that my father got sick of that. He made me come back here. And I came back, and my roommate and I formed a singing group, and we went around we were invited to sing at receptions and colloquium, and I heard a couple of colloquium. I heard one in biology that was just fascinating. I really couldn't believe it. And then I heard another one in sociology that was really exciting, and I've taken 3 biology courses here, and I feel like this place is, I'm so lucky to be here. I can make this my life, this work. This is such a privilege. That's all they saw. In the next semester, the grades of the African American students go up by 1/3 of a letter grade. And at the end of their college career, there's virtually no underperformance on the part of the African American students who were randomly, on a coin flip, assigned to see that videotape 3 years earlier or not see that videotape 3 years earlier. How could that happen? Well, here's how it happens. It happens because when I see this guy, I all of a sudden have a different narrative about my whole life and my whole experience and the whole nature of this university. It's like it's going to be a little bit weird, and the feelings I have are okay and normal. They're very okay. It's understandable. But underneath that, I'm going to get past that, and there's going to be some amazingly important things here that are really wonderful to experience. And I'm going to be able to experience them, and that's going to change that's going to send my life in a different trajectory. So now I've got a whole different narrative, if you will, a framework for thinking about my day-to-day experience. And I don't have to worry so damn much about what every cue in that situation means about my fate here. Now every cue, same cues are there, but they just don't mean that much anymore because all this is here. And I get into this, and the more I get into this, the better I do. And of course, the better I do, then the least significance those cues have. And there starts to be a positive cycle, a recursive cycle that gets me better and better and better. And underperformance is just the opposite, where I don't see that videotape. I start out pretty well. I have a little frustration. That worries the hell out of me. And I still have all these gloomy, global doubts that the stereotypes and the whole history of the society has got over my head, that little bubble over my head. I've still got all that. So I'm in a mire. This is a very stressful situation. I don't have as much resources to pay attention to my work. My work goes down, even confirms it worse, and I'm out of there. So we're getting a much better grasp of how these things operate within institutions like this one. And I think it is one of the real heartening elements here is that pretty easy interventions can have a pretty massive effect because they change this narrative, this internal narrative that's going on all the time. Yeah, this will be the last question, I guess, for everybody's sake.
So the anecdote that you just gave us seems to imply two things. One of them is a negative cascade where if you don't have this sort of positive intervention to protect you, then these hiccups that you have are interpreted as proof of the stereotype threat, and that continues down the road until you disprove it. On the flip side, it seems to say that positive experiences or doing well disproves because, after he gets through this vulnerable period, his positive experiences seem to say, I actually belong here. Is that sort of, worth taking away from that anecdote? Is that what you were trying to get at when you were talking about these frameworks that sort of sets you on the right track? Or am I completely off base?
No, I think that's right. I'm not sure, about every word of it, but I think that's basically the thrust of it. That the positive framework is a framework where there's realistic hope about the situation. There's no denial of the feelings of alienation. That's important. You can't treat, this is where the colorblind strategy can go wrong. You're feeling alienated. Why? We don't, come in, the water's fine. I don't know. I live in a society with a long history. Could the water be completely fine? That's what some little part of your brain is saying. So you credit that. Yeah, that's reasonable. But then you say, you're going to find over time that becomes less important, and that there's really room for you to succeed here and to thrive here. And that's going to relax you a little bit. That's going to create a little sense of space in the situation. Space. I don't have to interpret every cue and sort through everything and try to come to how much threat this means. I'm just a little freer from that whole thing. And being a little freer, I can be a little more involved. And being more involved, when people get involved, you love things. You start to really get excited about them. You see possibilities. You see new yous and things that you can do. And it becomes a very exciting kind of an experience. So that's how I think that narrative works. And I think some families are very good at that, preparing their kids for that. Look, when you go there, you're going to maybe feel this way, but don't worry about that. It's only natural. There was a group here once of undergraduates who had T-shirts saying, a minority undergraduates who had T-shirts that said, "It's just stereotype threat." It's just normal. You're normal. You're normal to have these anxieties. And you wouldn't, and you're going to get, they're easily, you can get past them, and you're going to find some very rewarding experiences here. So that's just a very different narrative than, Jesus, I'm in trouble. This is a deeply racist society. It's never going to heal. It's always going to be fraught. And that's a very doomsaying story. Now, I'm not arguing here for false consciousness. I'm arguing for realistic optimism. Anyway, thank you.